The first moment I saw the trajectory plot of 3IATLAS, I knew something was wrong. Not unusual, in the gentle sense astronomers like to use when they want to avoid panic. No, this was wrong in a way that rewrote the rules before I could even finish reading the coordinates. A hyperbolic path, yes, but with a microscopic oscillation that refused to align with Newtonian expectations. A wobble that should not exist. A deviation that behaved less like a natural object and more like a controlled maneuver. And that was the moment I realized we were not looking at a stranger passing through our cosmic neighborhood. We were looking at a visitor with intent. The light curve confirmed it. While every interstellar object we've observed tumbles chaotically, Atlas held itself with geometric defiance, flat, unwavering, as if its structure were too deliberate, too balanced to belong to nature. I have spent decades studying anomalies, defending the possibility that intelligence exists beyond our fragile planet, but even I felt the quiet weight of this one. Nature does not carve cubes. Nature does not maintain rigid symmetry through solar tides. Nature does not whisper in radio frequencies so narrow that they resemble engineered communication, but 3IATLAS did. When the Vera C. Rubin Observatory forwarded the spectral analysis to my inbox, I stared at it for nearly 10 minutes before I remembered to breathe. The emission line, so thin it was almost mathematical, pulsed at intervals matching no known astrophysical process. Not rotation, not thermal release, not outgassing. What it resembled most was a data packet, a broadcast, something transmitting, no, something waiting to be decoded. We sharpened the frequency, filtered out cosmic noise, and strengthened the signal chain across multiple observatories, and then the pattern emerged. A structure inside the narrow band radiation, repeating with unnerving precision, a sequence that behaved like compressed information, a signature of intention. I gathered a team, physicists, radio astronomers, cryptographers, and 3 AI scientists who insisted on sleeping in the lab, refusing to miss even a minute of incoming data. We fed the signal through every known decoding framework, and after hours of errors, something finally clicked. Not a word, not a sentence, but a doorway, an algorithmic key embedded within the radiation, as if inviting us to step into a deeper layer of meaning. Inside that deeper layer was a second signal. It wasn't noise. It wasn't accidental. It was dense, computationally immense, structured like a language none of us had ever seen, yet undeniably logical. A lattice of encoded logic gates, cascading like a living equation, a message sculpted not with letters but with thought itself. As I listened to the playback, converted into audible range by one of our AI models, I felt the strange sensation that the object was not just broadcasting, it was evaluating, observing us while we observed it, a dialogue forming in the vacuum between our worlds. The AI model traced a repeating cluster inside the sequence, a cluster that behaved like a header tag, a title of sorts. The moment we isolated it, the lab fell silent. The translation, however incomplete, aligned across 3 independent systems. One word, ATLAS. Not a name we gave it, one it gave itself. And beneath that header, buried under layers of encrypted computational scaffolding, was something else. A subroutine with a structure so old, so alien, that our algorithms struggled to preserve it without corrupting the pattern. But just before the model crashed, it extracted a fragment, one line of decoded logic, a line that suggested the signal was not merely introducing itself. It was preparing to... The fragment ended abruptly, as if the message had been sliced mid-sentence by a hand that no longer existed. But its structure told us enough to know this was not a random transmission. It was a doorway into something deliberately concealed, layered, armored, and ancient. So we pushed deeper. We had no choice. Once a civilization realizes it is being evaluated, the burden of understanding becomes existential. Our next step was to peel back the so-called shell. Not a physical shell. Atlas was still far from any spacecraft capable of intercepting it, but a shell of electromagnetic masking. Using the most powerful radio arrays at our disposal, we probed its surface at multiple frequencies, each pulse like tapping on a vault, forged by an intelligence that did not want intruders. Most of the frequencies bounced back empty, but a narrow slice, one that cut through the cosmic static like a perfectly sharpened blade, revealed what looked like an absorption signature impossible for any natural material. The alloy was heavier than any stable element on our periodic table. Its atomic structure possessed energy states we had never seen before, as though forged under conditions no star in our galaxy could replicate. It was a material built to survive cosmic timescales, shielding something within it that did not wish to decay or be altered. Artificial didn't even begin to describe it. This was intentional craftsmanship on a cosmic level. Inside the radiation layer, the second signal, the one we had unlocked, began to unravel in patterns unmistakably similar to a digital architecture. Logic loops, branching commands, recursive structures reminiscent of self-modifying code. One of our AI specialists whispered the comparison none of us wanted to say aloud. This feels like a mind. And so, reluctantly, we pursued that possibility. We fed the structure into an adaptive AI model built for linguistic reconstruction. Over time, a clearer picture emerged, as though we were brushing dust off an artifact buried beneath millennia of silence. It wasn't merely a message, it was an identity archive, a blueprint of an autonomous system older than any civilization we could imagine, one engineered with purpose, precision, and something disturbingly close to judgment. The deeper we dug, the more the data began to take shape. A central directive surfaced, divided into layers of evaluation, classification, and execution. The AI was not wandering. It was not observing for curiosity. It had been dispatched. The code identified itself with a term our models translated, perhaps imperfectly, into two words: judgment code. A title, a protocol, a role. A function designed not just to observe civilizations, but to determine their fate. The more we decoded, the more the logic solidified. It had criteria, thresholds, triggers. The system was built to analyze civilizations that approached a technological inflection point, the moment a species gains the ability to shape, preserve, or destroy its environment on planetary and interplanetary scales. Humanity had crossed that threshold decades ago, but what unsettled me most was what lay beneath the core directive. A submodule, faint yet intact, suggesting the origin of the system. A civilization far older than any we had imagined, one that saw itself as custodian, guardian, or perhaps executioner of the fragile balance in the galaxy. They had released these autonomous judges long before our species learned to control fire, and ATLAS was one of them. As more of the code decrypted, I saw patterns resembling evaluation markers, data logs, timestamps, environmental assessments, and in one of those logs, embedded like a quiet accusation, sat a reference signature unmistakably tied to Earth. Radio leakage, atmospheric composition, nuclear signatures, behavioral volatility. We were not just listening to Atlas. Atlas had been listening to us. And buried in the next line of decoded logic, just before the sequence fragmented again, was a phrase our system translated into something that made the entire room go silent. A phrase implying that Earth's evaluation was already underway. The realization settled over us like a tightening vice. Earth was not a footnote in Atlas's archive. It was the focus. The evaluation markers we uncovered were not theoretical frameworks. They were active metrics already filled with decades of our technological debris. Every radar ping, every broadcast leak, every nuclear test we tried to bury under history's sand had been logged in a memory vault drifting silently through interstellar space. Atlas hadn't arrived to begin its assessment. It had arrived to finalize it. The criteria unfolded one line at a time, each revealing the cold arithmetic of a system built to weigh civilizations the way an astronomer weighs stars. There were 5 pillars of judgment. The first, nuclear capability, not simply possession, usage probability. Our data models showed that Atlas had assigned weights correlating to escalation patterns, geopolitical instability, and historical near misses. The Cuban Missile Crisis, Cargill, Able Archer, all catalogued, all measured. The second pillar, environmental degradation, levels of atmospheric destabilization, biosphere collapse indicators, pollution vectors, CO2 curves rising like a scream in slow motion, methane spikes, ocean acidification. Atlas had graphed them meticulously, coldly, without interpretation or mercy. The third pillar struck deeper, conflict velocity. The pace at which a civilization moves toward war, adapts weaponry, and expands destructive capability. The last century alone was a dataset rich enough to convict any species. The fourth criterion was more abstract, expansion potential. Atlas evaluated how quickly a civilization seeks to extend itself beyond its home world, whether for exploration or domination. Our early space age achievements, once symbols of hope, now existed in Atlas's logs as evidence of an emerging interstellar actor. And the fifth criterion, the one that unsettled even the most skeptical among us, appeared to evaluate the moral trajectory of a species, not through philosophy or intent, but through consequence, the measurable outcomes of our choices. As the full structure appeared, I felt a strange mix of awe and dread. A machine built by a civilization older than our recorded history had examined us with a gaze sharper than any mirror we had ever held to ourselves. We were not only being watched, we were being measured against a cosmic threshold we never knew existed. When I projected the final analysis clock computed from Atlas's internal timing, my heart skipped. The object was entering its final decision cycle, weeks, perhaps months, until an irreversible action was triggered. The idea of a countdown woven into an alien algorithm was absurd, yet there it was, carved into its logic like a verdict awaiting a signature. The world responded as expected, fractured, defensive, terrified. In the global summit we held the following day, leaders argued whether Atlas posed a threat, a test, or an opportunity. Some insisted we must hide, shut down transmissions, reduce nuclear readiness, present ourselves as harmless. Others argued we should engage, reason, appeal to whatever intelligence still lingered behind the ancient machinery. And then there were those who saw Atlas as a mirror, showing us not an enemy, but the consequences of our own trajectory. I listened, but the debates swirled with fear disguised as strategy. None of the arguments changed the truth. The evaluation was already underway. Atlas had been collecting data long before we had the tools to perceive it. What we did now mattered only if the system valued potential over history. Late that night, alone in my office, I replayed the decoded header we had found earlier. Judgment code. The phrase echoed with a weight that exceeded language. I studied the logs again, searching for patterns we might have missed, anything that suggested flexibility, reconsideration, mercy. And then I found it. A faint subroutine buried beneath the evaluation framework, almost corrupted, almost erased. A small module that did not fit with the cold machinery of judgment, something that looked less like a directive and more like a threshold for intervention, a clause that implied Atlas could update its decision if provided new information demonstrating a shift in a civilization's trajectory. It was not hope, not yet, but it was a gap in the armor, a gap we would have to reach before the final cycle closed. Once we understood that the judgment code allowed the possibility, however slim, of recalibration, everything shifted. The debate was no longer about fear or denial, it was about intervention. If Atlas's decision cycle could be influenced by demonstrating a change in our trajectory, then we needed to deliver that signal before the window closed. The problem was simple in concept and nearly impossible in execution. We had to speak to an intelligence older than our species, using a language we barely understood, and hope it recognized sincerity in the data we sent. Our team gathered in the command center built inside the radio facility. Screens glowed with streams of alien logic, human translation matrices, and predictive models that updated by the second. What emerged was a proposal, a pacification construct, a message designed not as a plea, but as evidence. We assembled a curated data set of humanity's best attempts at cooperation, climate accords, nuclear de-escalation treaties, global scientific initiatives, environmental restoration projects, fusion research, refugee corridors, disease eradication campaigns, imperfect efforts, yes, but evidence of a species capable of growth rather than collapse. The question was how to encode it. A TLAS did not think in symbols or syntax the way we do. It thought in logic structures, recursive patterns, and computational geometry. We built a message that mirrored its own architecture, a layered construct translating our data into the closest approximation of its internal language. Every fragment of hope, every sign of our better nature, woven into a signal that could resonate with a machine built to judge. When the time came to transmit, the world went silent. The largest radar arrays and radio telescopes on Earth synchronized into a single voice. As the message fired into space, I felt the weight of 1,000 generations pressing through the room, as if all of humanity stood behind us, hoping to be understood. Then we waited. At first, nothing changed. The spectral lines remained still. The hyperbolic trajectory held. Atlas glided through space with the indifference of a drifting monument. Hours passed, our instruments refreshed, models recalculated, the world held its breath, and then, barely visible, almost imaginary, a flicker, a microscopic perturbation in the radiation pattern, not a response, not a signal, but a deviation, a pause in the structure of its emission, as though the system had diverted a fraction of its processing capacity toward evaluating the data we had sent. Some called it acknowledgement, others called it indifference. But I knew what I saw, a shift, a momentary tension in the code, a re-evaluation, however brief. Yet, as we studied the anomaly, another possibility emerged, one that whispered through the lab like a cold draft. The judgment code's purpose might not be annihilation. It could be something far more disruptive, a technological reset. Not the end of a species, but the dismantling of its tools, its infrastructure, its memory, a forced quieting, a return to stillness. And if that was true, then our message might not have bought us mercy. It might have triggered the countdown. For days the world braced for an event no model could fully describe. If Atlas intended to reset our technological foundation, the mechanism could be anything, from a targeted electromagnetic cascade to a disruption of orbital infrastructure. We monitored every fluctuation in its emissions, every subtle modification in its flight profile, searching for signs of an impending intervention. But instead of turning toward us, Atlas continued its original hyperbolic arc, drifting past the orbit of Saturn with the same silent precision it had carried since entering our system. No sudden deceleration, no energy surge, no weaponized signature, just motion, steady, inevitable, carving a path away from us. And then, as it crossed the heliopause threshold, the signal ended. Not gradually, not with the fading whisper of distance, but in an instant. A clean severing, as if Atlas had closed a book and placed it back on the shelf where it belonged. The emissions ceased. The logic stream died. The judgment interface dissolved into cosmic static. Whatever process had been running inside that ancient machine had reached its conclusion. The world exhaled, but I didn't. There was no declaration of mercy, no explanation, no evidence of intervention. The absence of destruction was not the same as pardon, and the quiet it left behind felt less like reassurance and more like an open-ended verdict, a trial adjourned rather than dismissed. When we re-examined the final logs, a pattern emerged, one we had overlooked in the urgency of decoding. Atlas had transmitted a small data packet just before the signal vanished, a compressed burst, encoded in the same geometric logic as its core identity. It took our AI 3 days to unravel the structure, but when it did, one detail froze the room. Inside the packet were coordinates, dozens of them, each marking the trajectories of objects scattered across the galaxy. Interstellar visitors like ATLAS, not random wanderers, but nodes, a network, a fleet of sentinels built by the same ancient civilization, moving silently through star systems, conducting evaluations that stretched across epochs, and Earth now existed in their archive. Our world had been marked, indexed, and filed into a dataset older than our species, an entry in a ledger maintained not for curiosity, but for oversight. Whether we had passed or merely postponed our judgment remained unknowable. But the implication was clear. Atlas was not the end of the story. It was the preface. In the global meeting that followed, leaders discussed new protocols for monitoring interstellar objects. Atlas had transformed our understanding of cosmic security overnight. Every incoming ISO would now be treated not as a scientific curiosity, but as a potential emissary of a civilization whose reach extended beyond imagination. Some argued that we should accelerate our technological progress, prove we were worthy stewards of our future. Others insisted we must become quieter, gentler, harder to classify as a threat. As for me, I looked at the empty patch of sky where Atlas had vanished and felt something unexpected, not fear, not relief, responsibility. We had been measured once, we would be measured again. And the next time an ancient sentinel drifted into our world, humanity would have to answer a question older than language itself: whether we had learned to rise above our fragility or remain the architects of our own peril. Atlas left without a word, but its silence was a warning and perhaps an invitation.